So why were the Chinese perceived as being so dangerous to American culture and society? Was it really just that they threatened American values, or was something else going on? Well, I think you are probably all aware, by now having done the readings, that there was something else going on, and that's that the economy in the West, in the United States, was not faring so well in the 1860s. There were very few job openings at the time, especially after the economic panic of 1873, which was essentially a global credit crisis like the one that we experienced in 2008. Making things even worse is that due to this economic downturn in the overall American economy, many Eastern residents, people who had been employed in the East, were unable to find work and decided to move west because they had heard stories about prosperity or even gold from the newspapers and from other media sources. This exacerbated the already high native unemployment rates in California, in Oregon, and in other parts of the West. Another factor was that the Chinese immigrants who came to the United States were often thought to be coolies or essentially slaves by white workers. They didn't understand that many of these Chinese workers chose to come to the United States for the same reasons that Europeans came to the United States. The Chinese laborers were seen by most white laborers as being cheap replacements for them, and they were also perceived as strikebreakers, so that when white workers made demands for higher wages or better working conditions and went off the job, they often saw Chinese laborers coming in to take their place, and this was something that they found very threatening. The increased presence of a very cheap exploitable labor force would make it much more difficult for them to raise their standard of living by raising wages and improving benefits and working conditions. So the next three slides contain more drawings and illustrations from the magazine The Wasp that really show how these labor politics played out in the discourse. So in this image, we can see that this fine worker here, who's being portrayed as St. Crispin, and we can talk about who that is in class. You can see two Chinese workers behind him with long swords, ready to chop his head off, essentially. It's important to recognize that the rhetoric that was being used by anti-Chinese immigration advocates was actually not quite what the reality of the situation was here. You don't see Chinese workers taking the jobs that white people had, semi-skilled or skilled jobs, but rather they were brought in to do very menial labor like build railroads. And here's an image of Chinese immigrants helping to build the Loma Prieta Railway in Southern California. But still, the Chinese were seen as people, as a group of people who needed to be dealt with by workers, or at least by people who wanted to rile up workers to fight against Chinese immigration. So here we can see clearly European working men dressed in laborer's clothes. He probably worked in a factory of some sort, and he was wearing a leather apron to protect himself from being hurt on the job, clearly punching a Chinese worker. The central point being made in this illustration is that white workers should and were fighting against Chinese immigrants. So at the same time that these images were appearing in journals and these conversations were being had by white workers, politicians in California were beginning to recognize that poor voters who identified themselves as being white were an important constituency, and they began to actively court them with anti-Chinese activities. Politically, they sought to unseat Republicans at the state level. Once in power at the state level, they imposed additional burdens on Chinese nationals wishing to enter into California, including very high bond requirements. However, a federal judge in 1875 invalidated these measures, arguing that the federal government had exclusive control over the regulation of immigration. As a result, anti-Chinese activists moved their battle to Washington. After 1875, they quickly succeeded in getting federal legislation passed outlawing the transport of Asian immigrants without their free consent and making it possible to deport Chinese prostitutes and Chinese nationals convicted of felonies. Anti-Chinese groups were happy with this success, but they wanted the federal government to go even further. A major problem for the Chinese is that they didn't vote in large numbers. There weren't that many of them in the United States, particularly outside of California, where they were already under increased political pressure. As such, they weren't considered a relevant voting bloc by politicians in Washington. Working-class white Californians, on the other hand, were seen as increasingly important in presidential elections as populations boomed when Eastern workers moved west in search of jobs. As such, both parties sought to curry favor with this white Western voter. This left the Chinese, with only the most idealistic politicians to support their cause in Washington. In a further blow to the ability of the Chinese to forcefully advocate for their rights to live in the country and to work in the country, in 1881, the U.S. government renegotiated the Burlingame Treaty, which gave the American government the right to regulate but not completely prohibit Chinese immigration. This development made it possible for Congress to take up the issue of Chinese exclusion for the first time at the national level. The result of the confluence of these trends was the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act on May 6, 1882. This act barred immigration of Chinese laborers for a period of 10 years, barred all Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizenship, although this was largely redundant because being white was a prerequisite for citizenship at this time. This act was also class-based, with the goal of ridding the country of cheap male laborers and female prostitutes. It's crucial to note that exemptions were made for merchants, teachers, particularly teachers of the Chinese language, students wishing to come to the United States to study, travelers, and diplomats. This law was challenged, but in 1889, the Supreme Court upheld the right of the U.S. government to exclude certain classes of immigrants based on national security interests. So this should give you a brief introduction to the developments in the way that Chinese immigrants were treated in the United States in the 19th century. And when we meet together in class, we're really going to talk more about the impact of this act. So we know that the act barred Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States, particularly those that were of lower social classes. But what was the broader impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act on American culture and American public policy? How did the Chinese Exclusion Act impact broader understandings of immigration in the United States? And what was the relationship between the Chinese Exclusion Act and later efforts to restrict immigration on a much broader scale in the 19-teens and 1920s? These are the questions that we'll take up when we meet and talk about this topic. This brings us to the end of the first set of recorded lectures in this class. As I've mentioned, I'm new to this, and I hope that you're able to give me constructive feedback, both in terms of the material that's presented and also my style. We can talk about this for a few minutes when we meet next week. Thanks so much.